Hey guys, it's Ornlu, and as of this past weekend, we have just wrapped up the Genesis tournament, Elite Gaming Channel's first AoE4 S-tier event. Well, it means the first AoE4 S-tier event, $20,000 prize pool, and it had a lot of hype, it had a lot of expectations because AoE4, it's a new game, we don't really know how it's going to play out just yet in terms of what, who's going to be dominating the eSport scene. Is there going to be an eSport scene? Is it viable? And this video is just going to be my personal experience recapping the whole event. I'm going to go through the results, the storylines, the in-game stuff, what we saw as far as the actual AoE4 gameplay goes. I have some statistics here. And then, of course, I'm going to be talking all about the sort of larger implications of the event, the more sort of community-oriented stuff afterwards. I do this for most of the AoE2 tournaments that I cast, at least the big ones. And since I, just did cast all of Genesis this past weekend, I thought that it would be good to do this as well, and at least sort of share my thoughts as to what I think of AoE4 as an esport, because it's definitely a mixed bag. But, of course, warning, there are going to be spoilers, all sorts of spoilers here, so, turn back now, run away if you wish to avoid those. But with that in mind, let's go ahead and dive right into the brackets, the results of the Genesis tournament. Alright, so I have now magically teleported to the other side of your screen, and we are here at the brackets on the Wikipedia page. I'll link that in the description so you guys can see it for yourself. And Genesis was a 2-day event. Well, we had qualifiers last weekend, but the main event itself was just an 8-person qualifier. You had just single elimination, best of 5 quarterfinals, best of 5 semifinals, and then a best of 7 grand finals. And already one of the first, the Viper won it, so congrats to him. Of course, he is one of my long-term AoE friends, and I think inarguably the most successful AoE2 player of all time. Whether or not he is the greatest or whatever, that is always going to be up for debate, but he, coming from AoE2, and coming off of his win at Red Bull Wallow 5, definitely there was a lot of expectation. He's a huge streamer, he just moved to Facebook, there's all of that controversy. Or drama, I guess. It's not really that controversial, but yeah, he was the guy who ended up taking the gold, but there's a lot more to this story here. So there were 8 qualified players for this event, and there was pretty diverse in terms of where they came from, in terms of RTS background, because obviously AoE4, it's a new game. One might expect AoE2 players to dominate in it, because on paper AoE4 is similar to AoE2. I think it plays more like AoE3 without cards, but that is a different point entirely. For AoE2, we had 3 representatives from our community. We had the Viper, we had Hera, another one of, the most successful players in recent years and a big streamer in his own right. And then we had Kasva, Turkish player who's been around for a long time. He was signed with one of the Turkish teams, I think bigger esports organizations, and he has been grinding AoE2 and AoE4 like crazy. And he was actually able to qualify for the event. So those were our AoE2 representatives. There were also 3 StarCraft 2 players. We had Lucifron and Vortex. These guys are brothers. I think they might have come from Warcraft 3, originally, but they were definitely in StarCraft 2 when I played the game and followed it, 10 years ago or thereabouts. And they are brothers. So, interesting that both of them are able to come to AoE4, and they're both, top players. They're both super good. And then the other StarCraft player is, of course, Marine Lord. Marine, sort of the most basic standard unit for the Terran race in StarCraft. Marine Lord actually has played a decent amount of AoE2. I believe he trained a lot with Sito, and he's a good AoE2 player in his own right, but obviously StarCraft 2 is what he, mostly comes from, and he, as of the time of the tournament, was actually the #1 ranked player on the ladder. And then we have our final 2 players, Recon and the Mista. So Recon, you might recognize him from AoE2. He is one of the better British players. He, I believe, played for Team UK in World Cup 2v2, at least the last one. And to be honest, I just never really thought, too much about him. Okay, he's a good, solid 2K plus British player. Apparently, he was also a top player in Age of Mythology back in the day, and also Age of Empires Online, the Age of Empires game we never, ever mention, which was a thing and is now no longer a thing. But he was actually very successful there as well. And, the other player here, the Mista, he was like the Viper in Age of Mythology. He was he's the best player. He was winning all of the tournaments and stuff like that. Also a top player in Age of Empires Online, or so I am told. But these guys were kind of a mystery because they're not that well known, because Age of Mythology, and especially Age of Empires Online, did not have big communities. They ended up performing pretty well, so just coming straight down to the results, our first set that we casted was Vortex versus Kasva. I thought that, okay, Vortex and Lucifron were pretty highly lauded, and the thing is here, we can't really say, oh, anyone's favored going into this tournament. This is the tournament to determine which players are, like, favored in future tournaments. Like, we know all of these guys are good, but it's just how good are they? So as far as, like, I'm aware, these matches are all pretty even. Now, Kasva looked really strong in the French mirror on Dry Arabia, but beyond that, it was like the Vortex show, and most notably, the very first game of the tournament was a really excellent game. It was the Delhi Sultanate that Vortex brought to the table, actually beating French, you know, the most popular Civ on just Lipany, the first game, with some really cool, like, fast castle, men-at-arms-y sorts of things. I'll talk more about that later when I go to, like, the meta stuff, but definitely Vortex and his brother Lucifron they were the guys that brought Delhi to the table in a big way. But yeah, Vortex looking pretty strong, able to defeat Kasva 3-1. In the closest set of the tournament was the second set between Marine Lord and the Mista, and yeah, this was a really, really close set. I think this was possibly the highest level set outside of the finals. Yeah, like, these guys were super back and forth. We had Marine Lord taking Lipany, then the Mista striking back on Dry Arabia, Mongolian Heights going back to Marine Lord, and then the Mista is able to make the double win happen on Mountain Pass and Boulder Bay. Boulder Bay being an exciting game number 5 because he was winning with Abbasids over French. Abbasids are a good civilization. I don't think anyone thinks that they're bad, at least nobody in their right minds. But using them on Boulder Bay was quite a shocker because Boulder Bay is a water map and French are like the water civ. And really interesting strategy from the Mista, went heavily on land, like mid-game aggression. Great game, able to clinch the win right there against Marine Lord in a close one. Then we had Recon versus Hera. I think a lot of people were expecting Hera to win simply because he is the far more well-known player. And although he looked really strong on the French mirror on Dry Arabia, kind of in a similar way to Kasva, where it was like all about just mechanical skill, like Hera looked good, but he did get strategically outplayed on all of the other maps. And Hill and Dale, I heard, was a close game in the Abbasid mirror. Unfortunately, Comcast decided to die in the middle of it, so like that's like the only game I didn't actually see all of. But when my internet dropped, Recon was making a comeback happen, so definitely really well done to him, and unfortunate for Hera, but Recon was advancing there. And then the final set was Lucifron versus the Viper. Of course, the Viper, huge name, following, all that stuff. Lucifron, people were expecting a lot of things from him as well. And honestly, the Viper looked a step ahead. In all of the games that he won, like all the games that he won, the Viper looked fairly dominant in all of them. Boulder Bay was probably like the closest one, but the only time that Lucifron really looked, strong was on Hill and Dale, where again, we have the Delhi Sultanate pick working out, and on that much more defensive map, we were seeing that, okay, Viper's, turtling up with the Abbasids on 2 TCs, so Lucifron is just going to go out and take map control, take the Sacred Sites with the Delhi. They can get the Sacred Sites in Feudal Age, and then they'll be generating 200 gold a minute with one of their attacks. It's really, really strong, and Lucifron was able to take the win with that, but in pretty much all of the other situations, the Viper looked like the better player. So that was day 1. 2 of the 3 AoE2 players eliminated, and we had 2 StarCraft players eliminated, and we had both Age of Mythology and Age of Empires Online players going through, which I think it's pretty cool for those guys, right, in that whole community. All 10 of them, Kappa. To be honest, both of the semifinals the next day were pretty, decisive. Vortex was able to win on Lipany, but beyond that, the Mista looked like just a cut above strategically. In general, the Mista, I would just categorize his playstyle as just, he has really good macro and is just really smart about how he takes engagements and sort of how he gets to the next step. Kind of similar to the Viper in a way. He's just like a good all-around player. He has some cool strategies. I would say that his mechanics aren't quite as sharp as Viper's, but he is maybe a little bit more familiar with some more of the unique civilizations, especially with the Abbasids. The Mista looks really sick. But that was the first semifinal. And then we had the second semifinal, the Viper versus Recon. Kind of a weird game on Mongolian Heights that Recon was able to win. I'll get more to that later, but other than that, Viper just looked kind of dominant and just looked like the better player, so Viper was then moving on to the finals. then we had our grand finals, the Mista versus the Viper. Mista was able to take game number 1 in a pretty nice Abbasids versus English game, where Mista was able to get to Castle Age much more quickly, and then just went with a lot of aggression. But from there was pretty much the Viper show. The Mista won Mongols on Mongolian Heights. I'll get more to that later. It's not much of an achievement to pat yourself on the back over, and then it was just really the Viper looking quite dominant at that point, and then Viper takes the win, and he will be the first victor of, the first big AoE4 tournament. So very, very interesting result, and we'll have to see how future tournaments play out in terms of, okay, is the Viper still going to be a top player? Is the Mista still going to be a top player? Or are things going to be shaking up even more as the meta sort of gets more figured out? So those are more of the results in terms of how the sets actually went. Now let's go ahead and talk about the actual game stuff. Alright, so like I mentioned, I do have a little stats spreadsheet that I'm going to pull up in just a second, but before we sort of go dive into all of like the Civ statistics and stuff like that, I want to talk briefly about the sort of overarching metagame trends that we saw throughout the event. So first, on my bullet point of notes I have written down, highly stratified Civ picks, by which I mean French and Mongols were completely dominant in terms of being almost universally picked at least once in almost every set. After English, we had sort of a smattering of English, Abbasids, and Rus, all of which had about the same play rate, and then maybe the occasional Delhi Sultanate pick. And then that was it. It was just like this very big gap between, okay, French Mongols, and then just, kind of 3 of those other Civs, and then maybe Delhi. So you can see that even though the game's only been out for a few weeks, people are very quickly determining, okay, this is like the best stuff that we can go for. And even still, players are finding new ways to make Civilization strong. Another thing that I found interesting was that, especially coming from AoE2, there was a relative, diverse selection of military units when it came to just your standard army composition on land maps. You saw a pretty equal amount of infantry, archers, and cavalry. I would say that infantry would be a little bit, like the most played, and then archers maybe the least played. But still, there was a definite, decent variety, as all 3 unit classes had their role in terms of what you wanted to go with. That said, early game was pretty clear. It was about, okay, if you're playing French or Rus, knight spam. Knights. Or if you are not those 2 civs, then it's all about archers plus spearmen, because usually you're against, French or Rus or something like that. And archer or spearman seems to work against pretty much everything in the feudal age, with the exception of men-at-arms. English and Holy Roman Empire, even though they were never played, do get those earlier men-at-arms, and that did prove to be a powerful unit in a few situations. For the one water map, Boulder Bay, at least again coming from AoE2, I'd say that water control is pretty much just as important as it was in AoE2, or is in AoE2 rather. Winning water in early game gives you a huge advantage going forward. It does not mean you win the game, necessarily, but you do have a pretty overwhelming, odd at that point, and especially in all of those Boulder Bay games, a lot of French mirrors, which I'll get to later, it was definitely water control. It's important. Fishing is good. Transport landings are good. And then the final sort of general meta point I had is that it's Happy Time Springald world, especially when they are built by infantry units, and then rams to some extent as well. The reason that we saw infantry played so much, well, at least a lot of the reason, is because for Abbasids, and especially for Mongols, they can build Springalds with their infantry. And Springalds are just kind of insane. They're good against, everything. Yes, they do die to, mass numbers of archers or cavalry especially, but if you can protect those with just some infantry or heavy cavalry units, the Springalds are able to dictate engagements because they have longer range than, everything else in the mid-game. And just being able to utilize that to both defend and push was just a really critical tool for success in a lot of situations, and even with civs that aren't Mongols or Abbasids, getting good Springald numbers was really important, and then pushing with rams also important. Alright, so this is the little spreadsheet I made. No, I am not Nerfox when it comes to making super well done spreadsheets with tons of detailed stats, but at least this was the best I could do at short notice, and I think it gives you the most important ones. So, just going to go through civilization by civilization and how they performed in the tournament. So, starting with English, I called them all reliable in my notes. They were just a good solid pick, even more so as the tournament progressed. Viper liked them a lot, and the thing is, they're strong, they're straightforward, and they're dependable in most matchups in most situations. You usually want to go for longbow spam, usually want to add a second town center, in Feudal Age, that is going to be sort of your best play. But you do have the option to go for men-at-arms, and something that's really important for the Civ is their ability to get the Hardened Spearman upgrade for free. It's one of the many unlisted Civ bonuses in AoE4. So they get the Feudal Age Spearman upgrade for free, which makes them much more resilient to early knight attacks compared to all the other Civs that actually have to pay for the upgrade and spend the time to research it. Skipping Chinese for the time being, we next have French, or hey, want to see me make the forums really tilted? So yes, every single series in the tournament had French picked at least once by each player. They were the most played Civ by far. Actually, not by that much, but still. They were played a ton. You can see there at their total pick rate, they were picked 24 times out of 62 total picks, or around 38.7%. There were 6 French mirrors, but they also had a really bad win rate, 3 wins and 9 losses. Now, here it should be mentioned that the way that the tournament Civ settings worked is that French could keep getting played because they kept on losing. When you won with a civilization, you couldn't pick them again. So we had this weird situation where players kept on picking French but then losing with them. And I think that's because, okay, yes, they're a very strong civilization. They're used on a ton of different map types. Pretty much every sort of map type we saw, there were French played on it, at least, at some point. The issues they ran into were, 1, against Mongols, which I'll get to, and 2, it's just they're so predictable and honestly kind of one-dimensional. Yeah, you go for your Night Rush, but then it was like, okay, if Night Rush doesn't work, then what? Yeah, okay, mix in archers, mix in spearmen as you need to, but especially past Feudal Age and then going into mid-game, French have a really hard time clicking up to the Castle Age simply because knights are so expensive and you kind of want to keep on making them so you don't die, and it does become kind of tricky at that point. Still, they were a solid pick, and I think that even though their win rate was poor, they're still a very strong Civ. They're just very straightforward, and I feel like French were just used as well, I don't know what to play, so I guess I'll just play French. I think as the meta gets more developed and people's understanding of the game is a little bit more nuanced, I think French will actually see a rise in success in high-level games, even without any balance patches, which I would hope would come at some point, but as of right now, we don't seem to have any on the horizon. So I think the big thing with French is just that they're a very strong Civ. They're inarguably a strong civilization. However, more so than that, they're an easy civilization, at least relative to the other ones in the game. They have a very straightforward game plan. I mean, it's like Franks in AoE2. And that game plan works in most situations, at least to some degree, and if you can execute it well, then you're going to have some sort of success. However, it also does make you predictable. So we'll have to see how the civilization's role in the overall metagame develops going forward. Oh yeah, and although French were picked on, all the different map types, they were especially common on Boulder Bay, because it was the water map, and French are kind of OP on water with their hulks, but then also on Arabia, which is the most open map, and that is just because Feudal Age Knights are really, really good, and when it comes to, okay, neither player's clicking up to Castle Age, French are going to be one of, if not the best Civs in the game in that situation. Skipping past the Holy Roman Empire for now, we move on to Mongols, or, as I call them, the OP Infantry Civ. Yeah, Mongols. 11 wins and 2 losses, with 0 mirror matchups. The second most picked Civ, with an 84.6% win rate. Holy bananas, this Civ just completely dominated the tournament. It's like, okay, each player, they're going to get their Mongol win. And there were definitely certain situations where Mongols just looked way better than the other civilizations. But what was interesting about it is a lot of the complaints that people have had towards Mongols, they weren't even showcased in this tournament. I don't believe, saw a single Mangudai, or maybe we saw one Mangudai. No army composition was ever based off of Mangudai. We might have seen the Silver Tree, trade boom landmark once. And then everything else was all about deer stones as the Feudal Age landmark to give your units that infantry speed boost with the Yam network. And of course, TC rushing, which has just been patched out of the game as of yesterday as I'm recording this, that was banned for the tournament, so that wasn't a factor either. What made Mongols so strong is that you can just get up in your opponent's face so quickly. They are the fastest civilization in the game. Their Yam network means that their units can force engagements, whether that's having your archers chase down enemy archers in Feudal Age, especially if you have the Khan signal arrow speed buff, or you just have your infantry units, moving almost as fast as cavalry. You get your cheaper outposts with the civilization and just speed around everywhere, and then the real kicker comes in the Castle Age, and where I joke about them being an OP infantry civ, is that they very rarely went for cavalry and almost, never went for cav archers or anything like that. It was all about men-at-arms and spearmen, and then building springgalds with those, like I mentioned earlier. The fact that Mongols are able to be so aggressive, and then on top of that build a bunch of springgalds with their infantry super fast, means that you're just able to pressure out almost like every civilization in the game. Like, there's almost nothing you can do to stop a bunch of men-at-arms, spearmen, and then like 6 springgalds in your base when you're like, okay, I have a siege workshop that I can make springgalds one at a time. And then when it came to Mongolian Heights, which I'll talk more about in a little bit, Mongols were just completely dominant on that map, and it just seems like in certain situations where you're very focused on early game, then Mongols are just incredibly strong. Now, Mongols were picked in every set, and every single player played Mongols at least once, except for Hera and Lucifron, both of whom lost. But yeah, everyone else picked Mongols at least once, and the thing is, they have a lower play percentage than French because, people won their game with Mongols. It's not like, oh, okay, well, I lost with Mongols, so then I'm going to play Mongols again. No. In all but 2 instances, they just won their game with Mongols, so I think that that's the reason we don't see like a bunch of Mongol mirrors or anything like that. It's just because the Civ got their win and then they just moved on with their life. Notably, the 2 losses for Mongols, in fact, were, I think, just picking Mongols in the worst possible situations, and then that whole thing kind of not, working. One of the Mongol losses was on Boulder Bay from Kasva, where, Mongols just aren't a good civ on Boulder Bay. The rush distance is too long, it's like a water map, and yeah, Mongols not going to be too successful. And the other loss was on Mountain Pass in the finals between the Mista and Viper, and when I was casting that, I was just baffled by Mista's choice to pick Mongols on that particular map. Again, it's a very defensive map. Viper was English, he was able to just turtle in his base and just completely weather the storm of the Mongol aggression and then just smash him in the face later on. So those were the only 2 times Mongols lost, and every other game they won. So very much the standout civ. From the tournament, they are now going to be the civ to beat on the ladder, at least among higher level players. Moving on now to the Rus. Oh man, they did not have the greatest showing. They were played 7 times, but they had a 1 win and 6 loss record, so 14.3% win rate. That is bad. So that's why I subtitled them, weren't we supposed to be a top civ? Yes, in my, day 1 tier list video, I actually had Rus as the best civ by a small margin. The Rus are still really, really good. However, I do think that the stats in this case are really skewed by the fact that 5 of their 6 losses came from facing Mongols. You could see Rus as okay, we're 1-6, or you could see them as, okay, we are 1-1 against French, and then 0-5 against Mongols. Clearly, Rus versus Mongols is not a good matchup for Rus, and that's just kind of what players kept on running into, seemingly. And I do think that French aren't even an amazing matchup either, so at least on open maps, because French are just better at the full feudal age play. But yeah, it was very clear that Rus could get pressured out in early game by Mongols, and then especially in that Castle Age, it's like Mongols, they keep up the aggression, and then boom, Castle Age comes in, and then you have 6 springgalds in your base, and then you have okay, I'll just build my 1 siege workshop springgald, and then you just die. So yeah, Rus, not the best showing, but I also think that there were a lot of bad situations in which Rus were used, and I think that, this is still a small sample size, and with more games and, more tournaments, I think that the Civ will finally, get into its niche, so to say. I still stand by the fact that they are a top Civ when played correctly, just not against Mongols in the current meta, and then they're kind of iffy against French. So I guess I'd call them probably the 2nd or 3rd best Civ. Now we move on to the Delhi Sultanate, or wait, this is a Civ? Yeah, going into this event, I think a lot of players, including myself, expected Delhi to be the least picked civilization. And I guess they were, of the Civs that got picked at all. But specifically, the brother duo of Lucifron and Vortex were able to show that the Civ does have its role. It's a very hard Civ to play, and it is a slow civilization, there's no getting around that. But if you're able to use them to their fullest potential, they can just completely run over civilizations in mid-game. Now this comes on the back of being able to get the sacred sites in the feudal age with double the gold revenue. It's just such a massive advantage. If your opponent is playing passively, then it's like there's nothing they can do to stop you. You just get such a huge lead. You research all of those technologies for free, and then like in mid-game, you're just spamming a bunch of men-at-arms and spearmen. No elephants, unfortunately. And then you're just completely overrunning your opponent with a much more well-upgraded army with all of the gold income from those sacred sites. So clearly there's a lot going on with the Civ that we have, yet to learn about. It's not like they had an amazing win rate, but I think the fact that they were able to do, decently at all is... It speaks to how the Civ really has yet to be learned completely. And finally, for the Civs that were played, we have Abbasids, or as I call them, the boomer version of Mongols. So yes, Abbasids, like Rus and English, they were picked, a decent amount of times. They had a pretty nice showing, especially on maps like Hill and Dale, where they could just boom up on 2 town centers. The fact that you can get to Feudal Age and then just get that tech that makes your villagers cost only 25 food instead of 50 food means that you can get a big eco lead. You have a bunch of other eco techs on top of it. And then in mid-game, like your big kicker is the ability to go through or go for your spring golds with infantry. You don't even need to get like the siege engineers tech or anything like that. You can just build a bunch of spring golds. So you go for a big eco, and then you can push with a bunch of infantry and spring golds or crossbowmen. Unfortunately, we did not see any camels. That honestly speaks to the fact that we really didn't see like any unique units in this tournament. Kind of unfortunate, honestly. The only unique units that we saw extensively were stuff like the longbowman and the French knight, which are kind of just like slight variations of the standard units. Like, okay, they're like slightly better than your regular unit. Nothing like that's completely unique. We didn't see like the Mangudai, we didn't see the camels, we didn't see elephants, we didn't see the Streltsi. So I do think that's pretty unfortunate. But still, Abbasids, they are a strong Civ, they're pretty reliable, they're pretty flexible, and definitely one that you can take into a lot of different situations and be successful with. And then, of course, we have the Holy Roman Empire in Chinese, or as I call them, Sir not appearing in this film. I do think it's really unfortunate that, a quarter of the Civs weren't played, but I kind of understand why. In the case of the Holy Roman Empire, they're too weak, they're generic, and their prelates are super buggy in that they don't cleanly auto-inspire your villagers, so you're not getting that eco bonus that you would want to be going for. And I think it says a lot that in the tournament that was dictated by infantry, the infantry civ, the Holy Roman Empire, was like never played. Mongols had like better infantry in practice because they could just speed up their infantry so much with their Yam network. And that is kind of sad for the civilization. They just feel really generic. It's like, other than infantry, they don't have a whole lot going for them. I mean, yeah, you have like good defenses, but yeah, I don't know. I feel like Holy Roman Empire needs a little bit of work so that they can find their role in the game beyond just spamming men-at-arms and then like defending. Now, in the case of Chinese, I think this is more of, the Civ is actually good. It's probably really good, in fact. But it's so hard to play that nobody's really figured them out yet because it's going to take time to figure out Chinese. And when players are trying to practice for a tournament, they don't want to be like completely figuring out and inventing how to play a civilization. They want to be refining stuff that they sort of already know. And that's why we didn't see any Chinese, which is unfortunate. It is a cool civ, but yeah, we're going to need a little bit more time to get figured out there. And so that's more sort of my civ breakdown for the tournament. Yes, it was very much dominated by the Mongols in terms of winning, and then the French in terms of playing, but there were a few other interesting points to talk about for all of the other civs that got played. Because I'm already rambling a lot, just to briefly go through the map pick rates, Lipany was the default map. Lipany is actually Arabia from AoE2, and Arabia is like super Atacama, open map. So Lipany's a little bit more closed, but it's essentially Arabia. And then Arabia itself was also picked in every single set. There were 7 sets in total, so there you go. And then Boulder Bay was picked 5 times, French, very common on that map. Mongolian Heights was the next most picked one. 4 games on Mongolian Heights, Mongols themselves were picked 4 times, and they won 4 times. Literally, Mongols went 4-0 on that map, yeah. Definitely getting that OP IRL Civ boost right there. And then Hill and Dale was played a few times. We had 2 Abbasid wins, I believe, and then a Delhi win. Just a much more defensively oriented map. Mountain Pass a couple times, and everything else was just kind of, a game. Nothing really to write home about. And so that's sort of my breakdown of the Civ stats and all of that. There's clearly a lot to still be figured out with this game, and there's a lot that's really buggy and stuff that's not that well balanced, and, well, I guess that sort of leads us to our more macro discussion here at the end. Hello again. And this sort of brings us to our last main point, and I think what a lot of people are really interested in with this video, and that is me talking about AoE4 as an eSport. I have a lot of mixed feelings here. So first, I put general interest, and by that I pretty much mean viewer numbers and how much, the various AoE and other communities are talking about the game. And there were very high viewer numbers. I think the tournament got like 30,000 viewers plus at some point. There was a big overlap with, like, one of the biggest French streamers on Twitch, I believe, was doing an AoE4 LAN, which got like a ton of views. That sort of like boosted AoE4's like total viewership. And I'm sure a lot of people found Genesis from that. But still, I don't think anybody can be like unhappy with, how the viewers went. And I did see a fair amount of discussion on various Reddit threads and on Discord servers, but that's just my experience. It seemed like people were talking about the tournament. So from that standpoint, I do think that the tournament was a success. Now we get to the more controversial stuff, I suppose. And again, this is all just my opinion. So I am differentiating spectating experience with viewer experience, and when I say spectating experience, I'm talking about the actual in-game experience, like what's in AoE4 to watch AoE4. And then the viewer experience is more of like, okay, what are you guys experiencing? What do you guys think as you're watching this tournament, as you're listening to me or someone else ramble on about the game? So starting with the AoE4 stuff, it's not good. The actual spectating features of this game are just not good. It was clearly an afterthought. It was not prioritized when it came to, okay, these are the things we need for the game's launch. And like, I can't really, dispute that. I'm no like eSport video game businessman, but the two biggest issues like that were just kind of unforgivable, to be honest. The friends list issue and the timer issue. When I say friends list issue, it's because in AoE4, the lobbies are broken. Now, in AoE2, we're used to this. We're just used to a broken lobby system, so we use AoE2.net or recently the AoE2 spectator dashboard. But AoE4 didn't have that until like the very end of the tournament or something like that. So the only way to reliably spectate a game was to have the pro player on your friends list, and then you could just observe their game that way. Which made it very difficult for, casters to get into the game because, all of these players are getting bombarded with friend requests from people they don't know. And like, that's not really fair to them either. They should be focusing on, trying to prepare for their match, right? Not just like figuring out, okay, who's like a random person and who's a caster. Unless they just happen to know the casters already, but that's really only the case, like, in my case for, like, the AoE2 people. Like, I know the AoE2 players, but if somebody's coming from a different game, they might not know them, or vice versa. And that's honestly just kind of unforgivable. To just not have any sort of infrastructure there. And then the other big one was the timer. In the top right-hand corner, when you're spectating a game of AoE4, there's the game timer. And because of the delay, the in-game delay, which I'll talk about in a little bit, you had to see the time. And so you would always be spoiled as to the result of the game. There was no way to get rid of it, and that, it's such a basic issue that I don't understand how this was, part of the launched version of the game. Now, when it comes to streaming, it's not too big of an issue. I was just able to put the tournament banner over the timer in the upper right-hand corner so that, you guys, the viewers, weren't, spoiled as to those results. But that doesn't work on my end in terms of, me watching the game. So literally what I needed to do was I got a Post-it note and just put it on the corner of my computer so that it would block the timer so that I wasn't spoiled as to, oh, okay, then the game's going to end in a few minutes. This should not be a thing that I need to do or that anyone else needs to do. So I think that those are the issues that are so basic that it's I can't even. Then we come into a lot of other issues. First, I put incorrect and missing statistics. The user interface in AoE4 is not good, and this also speaks to the casting overlay in general. A lot of the various stats that they showed just weren't accurate. I don't know how they calculated it. The score calculation in AoE4 seems really, really weird. It's hard to tell when upgrades come in if you don't know all of the numbers specifically. You can't see the French charge damage to their bonus damage to their regular damage. And yeah, it's just really not good. Your post-game stats, half of it's blocked out, half of it is behind a side-scrolling thing, and it's not something that we would expect from a AAA esports ready title. Then when it comes to the overlay itself, there's no overlay that shows, oh, okay, at a very basic level, this is what I want from an overlay. And this is what AoE2 DE had at launch, and although it was certainly not enough compared to Capture Age, which we were really spoiled with, at least we had a tab that would show okay, here's the population, here's the military count, here's the villager count, and then here's the KD. Those four stats, total population, villager count, military count, and then KD. Like, those things I just need to have on the screen. Like, if they're jumping onto the stream in the middle of a game, viewers need to be able to just see at a glance, okay, this is what's going on. The score is one way to tell, like, okay, who's winning and who's losing, but just looking at those numbers, if you're seeing that one player's like 30 pop ahead, then, okay, you know that they'll likely have some sort of advantage. Another way, another thing that's missing is, there's a very, very little tiny flag in the corner of the screen that shows the player civilizations, but unless you know all the flags, and unless you have your binoculars ready to see those little icons, you just can't even tell the civilizations. When it comes to hotkeys, we can't have hotkeys in general in this game, which is a whole nother issue, or at least, our regular hotkeys from other RTS games, but we're really missing things like switching player POVs with just like a hotkey. Like, I had to drag my cursor up to the corner of the screen and then manually switch it every single time, which is annoying. We don't have all of like the jump to building hotkeys, like just like go to this building, and yeah, there's just a lot of like very basic hotkeys from AoE2 that are missing, and probably other RTS games in general. And it's like it just makes it really frustrating as a caster to cast the game. And then other core missing or just bad features, the zoom level. The game is too zoomed in. I mean, like, people complain that I cast AoE2 too zoomed in, but like, at least that's more zoomed out than this. And you have like the weird sort of not exactly top-down thing where stuff that's like further away is like harder to see. It's just hard to differentiate between units and buildings and stuff, but that's like more of like a game issue itself. You have the weird fog thing. Why is there fog? Especially on a map like Hill and Dale, where it's like you'd look at a player's base and then like beyond the cliffs, like to this, outside of their base, it's like you just can't see anything. It's like, why is this a thing? There's no hidden pick for civilization, so players had to use a third-party program just to pick a civilization, which, like, again, it's just baffling why this isn't a thing. You can't see the map on the loading screen, so I don't know what these maps are before the game is launched, which is really confusing, and the game launch happened to be quite a long time, because I don't know if this was a tournament thing or if this is just a feature in the game. Every single game had a 5-minute spectator delay. That's way too much. That's way too much. That meant for a tournament that had 31 maps played, it was whatever 31 times 5 is. You know what? I'm busting out my calculator. 31 times 5 meant that there was 155 minutes of the weekend spent just with spectator delay. That is really annoying when it comes to just the consistent flow of like, okay, we're going from one game into the next game. Like, sure, you want to have some spectator delay for, tournament competitive integrity, but like, just make it a 2-minute spec delay. I don't know. Maybe I'm just too trusting and think that spec cheating isn't like that big of a deal if it's like 2 minutes, but that was really frustrating. But anyway, I can already tell that I'm going to need to cut a lot of this footage. Viewer experience. So this, like, now I'm going to talk about, okay, my experience is like casting the game and also like watching the game, because that's what I'm doing. It might be different from you guys watching on Twitch or YouTube or Facebook or whatever. So definitely let me know in the comments what you guys think watching AoE4 is like, because I'd love to know, because I don't have all the answers, right? The whole world is kind of a mystery, but personally, I found that in the 31 matches of AoE4 I casted this weekend, there are some good games. There are some really interesting games. And there are just aspects of game which is like, okay, it's really cool to see how these players are figuring out, stuff like Delhi or Abbasids or anything like that. Unfortunately, it's often very boring and or confusing, in my opinion. There are a lot of games that are just like, okay, it's a French mirror and they're gonna do the same thing, and it's like, games can be really slow. I remember people saying that, oh, AoE2 is way too slow to be an eSport, and AoE4, it's going to be, speeding things up. AoE4 is no faster than AoE2. That isn't to say that AoE2 is a speedy game by any means, but AoE4, it's not fast. Like, in the fastest games, like, maybe you're starting real fighting at, like, 5 minutes, but we have to remember that AoE4 uses real time, like 1 second equals 1 second in-game. But in AoE2, due to a very confusing reason. In-game time is 1.7 times real time. So again, busting out the old calculator here, if fighting in the earliest cases in AoE4, at least in like a major way, happens at 5 minutes, 5 times 1.7. That's 8.5 minutes AoE2 game time, which is also kind of the same thing. And oftentimes it would take like 12 minutes game time for anything to happen, especially on something like Boulder Bay, and 12 times 1.7 is 20.4, so that'd be like 20.4 minutes in AoE2 where like nothing was happening. Or it's like players will be getting a lead, and then they just either can't close it out, or I don't know. This could just be players not being comfortable enough with the game, but it doesn't make for a great spectating experience. Also, the viewer knowledge floor, as I put it, it's a very, very well thought out term. It's way more complex than AoE2. There's just so much like base knowledge that you need to like understand what the heck is going on in a game of AoE4, because there are all these like tiny little differences, a lot of stats that aren't apparent, like the example I used earlier of the French Knights. I have 4 different attacks. You have your charge attack, you have your French bonus attack, that's like after your charge attack, and then you have your regular attack in melee combat, and then you have your torch attack against siege units and buildings. Like, it's so confusing. You know, there's a bajillion different upgrades, some of them are broken, a lot of the civ mechanics are really confusing. Yes, there are plenty of successful esports games, like all of the MOBAs are like have very high like knowledge floors for you to understand what's going on, but I still don't think that's a good thing. But like this could just be my experience. Overall, I have to say, like I enjoy AoE4. I like playing AoE4 multiplayer. Casting AoE4 I can enjoy, but I very often get bored and or confused. And of course, like that's like my fault to some degree of like just not, I guess, being able to make the game interesting for people. And if like I'm not interested, then like that's not a great streaming experience. But I really am trying to enjoy AoE4. But the fact that I'm having to like force myself to try and enjoy AoE4, it's not my favorite. But still, it doesn't mean that I can't have a good time, right? And I do think that as the game develops, as a lot of the sort of rough edges of AoE4 get smoothed out, I think that it can be an enjoyable experience. I don't know like how enjoyable. It like depends on how polished the game ever gets and what it looks like even at that point, what tournaments are going to be looking like. But I feel like it can be good. But as it stands right now, viewer numbers aside, I felt like watching Genesis just, other than the few good games, it just wasn't that enjoyable. But, you know, obviously, that's just my opinion. Please, please, please let me know what you think in the comments. Feel free to disagree with me. If you really enjoyed Genesis, tell me why. AoE4, okay, and then I guess this sort of brings us to our last point. Going forward, my footage at this point is almost an hour long, so, oh boy, this is going to be fun to edit. What do we think of AoE4 as an esport going forward? There are going to be more AoE4 events for sure. Like, statistically, numerically, Genesis was very clearly a success, and I think that sponsors are going to be interested in hosting more events. However, that is going to have to sort of be compared against just how long are players going to be interested. The player count has dropped massively since launch. Yes, that happens with every game, but still, we have to see how popular is AoE4 going to be once the variety streamers leave, once all of the streamers and YouTubers who come from other games go back to those other games. Like, say, just as an example, Grubby, very popular streamer, Warcraft player. What if he goes back to Warcraft? I don't know if he will, but just like as an example, are these people going to be committed to the game's success in the long term? Are people just going to want to play the game? Tons of people just play the game for the single player and then, you know, stop playing the game. That's why I do campaign videos. And the simple fact is, I don't know. Nobody knows. Anyone who says that they know, oh, AoE4 is going to, you know, it's going to completely tank and then it's just going to be back to AoE2 as business as usual. Oh, AoE4 is going to kill AoE2. We just don't know. There are a lot of things about the game it's really cool. There are so many issues, both large and small, both like very, very basic to the game and sort of simple fixes that you can make, but still like very, very much need to be made. Like getting rid of the game timer in spectating. Those things like really need to be prioritized, and there need to be a lot of updates for the game. So we'll just have to see. Personally, I feel like as a casting experience, just watching tournaments, I feel like it is a downgrade from AoE2 right now. But we'll have to see what the future holds. Personally, if there's a big AoE4 tournament, I'm going to cast it. I am interested enough in it, and I feel like the general interest is enough in it that I am, if there's a big AoE4 tournament, I'm going to cast it. You know, at least if there isn't like also a huge AoE2 tournament at the same time, but that's probably not going to happen. But at least for me right now, my priority is going to stick with AoE2. It's the game I love, and it's what you guys enjoy watching, at least when it comes to my content. And that is going to be my, I guess, main focus. But that, it's like, okay, yeah, I'm going to stick with AoE2, but also, you know, AoE4, if it is successful and if the game gets more polished, I am totally open to, you know, casting a ton more of AoE4. I'm going to keep up on the, like, all of the meta developments. I'm going to at least play the game fairly frequently, because I do want to sort of keep in the loop, so to say, but we'll just have to see how it plays out. Anyway, that's going to be my recap for the Genesis tournament. Lots of rambling, sorry about that, but there's just a lot to talk about for the first big AoE4 tournament, so I hope you guys enjoyed. Please do leave a like and comment and all that stuff if you did enjoy, and I will see you all next time.